Hey guys, welcome back. Next up, we've got Damian from Proofpoint and Nick from The Missing Link. So Damian's been in the industry for about 20 years now, and he's got experience across networking, email security, Seams, cloud security, the whole works. And Nick is a security architect with a background in specialist counterintelligence operations and was previously part of the management team at the SOC and Facebook. So interesting stuff. They're going to be talking about how the threat landscapes have changed since the pandemic. So it's pretty topical as well. Nick, I think you're leading first. When you're ready, take it from there.
Cool. Thank you very much. Cheers, mate. Cool. All right. So no, thank you very much for the introduction. As you heard, the presentation will be by myself and Damian. The kind of the way it's going to be structured is almost in three parts. So there'll be myself, which kicks off just to give a bit of an update, overview of the current threat landscape, and a couple of details there. Then I'm going to move into more of a how you actually set up a program or insider threat programmer for an organization, be it small, large, enterprise, government. I've tried to make it as scalable and as kind of agnostic in terms of industry as possible. And then we'll go through that kind of methodology, that framework, and then Damian's gonna jump in with some specific use cases and kind of the kind of proof point technologies that can really support an insider threat program well. So jumping in, as a kind of outlook as to how 2020 has gone, we don't need to labour the point that obviously infrastructure, operations, everything about business has changed, and kind of every CISO, every ISM's 1 to 3 year plan is pretty much kind of slowly hanging on by a thread. You do kind of see changes, and certainly from a kind of consultative perspective, constantly getting clients that are just saying, feel like they're losing their grip on the kind of security controls and technologies that they've put in place in prep. One thing that is notable and certainly on the rise is that increased number of endpoints. Increased number of endpoints across the organization, increased or a requirement of access to your applications for those remote workers, as well as kind of that introduction of shadow IT, be it actual devices, BYOD devices, or cloud services, what have you. Another thing, we'll certainly go into a little bit more detail, is that the increased risk and how you actually manage privilege access and your privileged users while they're remote, as well as just missing that kind of or the change in the fact that onboarding and the training and kind of awareness programs that you run are no longer in person now, and getting that outreach to remote employees is difficult. And then finally, it is I suppose a difficult topic, for everyone. But there has been kind of severances and a variety of different either redundancies or kind of people being furloughed as a result of operations and reduction in revenue, and that obviously does bring its own risks with employees either departing or potentially departing if they see that kind of risk in the foreseeable future. Sorry, I just get cool. So what actually are insider threats? Now, Proofpoint and certainly ourselves classify insider threats as in three different categories. There's negligence, there's malicious, and then there's compromised. All very different. There is some kind of permutation between the two in some cases, certainly in the malicious and compromised, but really critical to define these as kind of separate entities. And I think really interesting, negligence or just accidental insider data loss or disclosure does actually kind of account for over 62 or around 62% of incidents globally. Linking that with the actual revenue or cost of an incident, average cost of an incident is around 300K. Now, looking more at the kind of malicious insiders, those that are there with malicious intent, that are potentially exfiltrating data, conducting those kind of sabotage incidents. That obviously sits around 14% of all incidents, but you can see that the cost of those incidents does increase, well, over double, if not nearly 300%, those kind of negligence. And the same for those compromised users that have their credentials or machines actually compromised. So actually looking at, I suppose, the profiling of an insider and the motivations, what drives an insider, what actually, how can you predict or identify those in your organization that could potentially be an insider? And I suppose what I'm using here is it's a kind of mnemonic that we used to use, and it's used typically for offensive human operations, and that is, how do we manage, how do we identify potential covert human intelligence sources or agents? And these are typically the driving factors that that we can use. But what I've kind of done is circle that back and then put a blue spin on it. So how, if this is what our insiders are going to be driven by, how do we kind of identify and protect our organization through kind of the predictive analysis or identification of these drivers? And I think it's really critical to firstly identify a use case or an actual motivational driver, identify employees that are linked to that, and then also identify their actions, because it is a kind of sliding scale, and I've got a couple of examples of how we can how we can do that. So we have first and foremost, straight up front, a disgruntled employee. Now, where roughly is that going to sit on this kind of this matrix? And it could be money related, it could be ego related. It's going to sit towards the kind of top end within those categories there. And actually, what are those the kind of use cases or the actions conducted by this the disgruntled employee? That could be sabotage. It could be a kind of data exfiltration, or it could just be poor or a lack of kind of care or due diligence with their own work. So the next one could be a departing employee. Now, obviously, we do have to kind of it can be linked to disgruntled employees, but as a departing employee, what you're typically going to have is a designated time period, either when a notice has been or resignation has been submitted, or the rumor mill has started, or there's formal communications gone out about any kind of severances or M&A, those types of activity. So you are potentially going to get more of a kind of insight or a kind of indicator of potential use case. But still, it's going to look at departing employee. Could be ego, they could be disaffected as a result. It could be money related, or it could be ideology in a sense that they've kind of lost their way with their business, and they are obviously either looking to set up on their own or move to a competitor potentially. Now again, remote workers, we did have kind of covered off this at the beginning, but remote workers, and I suppose linking that to the next use case, that's going to be potentially more towards the compromise, that increased risk of compromised users or assets as a result of them utilizing shadow services, or not actually using the controls, web proxies or gateways or what have you that are set up to protect the corporate environment. So obviously that does bring its own risks, and with compromise, the likelihood is it's then going to be data exfiltration or potential lateral movement within the environment. Contractors and third parties, I've got this as a specific use case for those industries and organisations that do really have strict controls or audit requirements on their third parties. But also it can be linked to external or malicious third parties, be it from a corporate espionage perspective, or a state or kind of international kind of sophisticated foreign intelligence service or state-sponsored actor. And again, typically these the kind of latter of those is going to be linked to potentially ideology, but also compromise through the kind of introduction of malware or what have you into your organization. But from an actual contractors or suppliers perspective, again, that risk is really with compromise from remote workers gaining access to your critical infrastructure or assets. And I think one thing that is often overlooked, and the last two are very kind of human-centric, in the sense that not all insider incidents, as we said with the kind of negligence, that negligence category, are linked to malicious activity. Ultimately, it has been a hard period for everyone. Everyone is kind of stress is on the increase, and it can play a part in people's kind of day-to-day operations and the way that they go about their business. So it's definitely one to be aware of, and employee burnout is certainly something that should pique your interest as a kind of ISM or CISO, and understanding how that impacts your insider threat. Likely kind of instance could be configuration or misconfigurations or mass data exfiltration accidentally through human error. And also, as I said at the beginning, it's harder to get that outreach in the onboarding stage with your kind of continuous security awareness and training programs. So again, increased risk of compromise, just because that effectiveness of training can sometimes be reduced due to remote working. So now, I suppose I'm moving on to the framework, onto this insider threat framework. And what I've tried to do is create what we certainly have created is a scalable, measurable, and repeatable process that's just a continuous cycle. And we have, well, first of all, insider threat can often feel, it's very daunting, and it can feel like a needle in a haystack. There's also a lot of kind of discussions or concerns around the ethics behind it, or the morality, and kind of an individual or employee's privacy. So hopefully what I'll kind of get out during this section is kind of covering off those points and kind of justifying the kind of need to have an intelligence-led and a risk-based insider threat program. So starting off with the identify. In a previous life, I was in the military, and we used what was called the combat estimate. Started with 7 questions, and the first question was always down to intelligence. And it was, referred to as question 1. Used to be, what is the enemy doing and why? But as we moved into more conventional operations, it changed. And this is a question that we were always posed: what is the situation, and how does it affect me? And I like to kind of break this down into 3 distinct parts. So the first one is security intelligence preparation of your environment or your organization. So you sit down and think of it like a bird table, like a kind of map, with various different filters or kind of covers over it. So you have site. What are the threats? That's ultimately what you're answering within in this section. what industry are you in? What departments do you have? What level of vetting is required within your organization? What are your clients' expectations? Answering all those questions and getting that the kind of baseline of your organization to understand, what really are the threats. Within this is also going to be, what are the current incidents that have occurred? Doing that kind of enriching or providing the context to understand the current threat intelligence for your industry and your geographical location. The next step is threat integration. So that's where are our risks, and that's taking into account the threats and the kind of baseline that we've created in the preparation phase, and overlaying all of the controls, all of the programs and educational aspects of your role, as well as any of the kind of monitoring and detection capabilities that you have. This is where you overlay. So this is where you're going to find out, potentially where your gaps are, certainly where your kind of risks are, and from this, I suppose good examples of this are, yes, our threats are a department, R&D, for example, but what were the R&D scores on our last phishing simulation, or what was the department scores on, or how are they fully compliant with their security awareness training? Have they received the right levels of vetting? Are they receiving the follow-up, travel debriefs and the like? Identifying those risks and actually calling out specific areas, as opposed to just identifying risky assets based on their sensitivity or their criticality. It's actually a kind of a more targeted approach to not just standard risks, but also kind of dynamic risks. And this can be done on a kind of regular basis based on those kind of those programs and those information feeds. And then finally, what we have is the threat evaluation. So we have most likely courses of action and most dangerous courses of action. And these are ultimately same as a SIEM, same as any kind of monitoring and detection programs or technologies that you have. You identify your use cases, and the most likely are going to be most common, and the most dangerous are going to be what is the worst thing that could possibly happen to us, and what controls and what kind of monitoring and detection and response tools do we have to actually support us if that was to take place. And these are graded in terms of most likely course of action 1, most likely course of action 2, and then and so on and so forth. But I think this is a really good opportunity as a business, because it should be done as a kind of cross-functional exercise, just to understand, and always coming back to what are the threats to our people, and specifically from an insider perspective. I think one thing certainly that's going to assist with that is head over to kind of this URL where you can conduct it's around 30 questions, and it's covering all kind of aspects of privacy and compliance, monitoring, detection, retention, all the policy as well. So there's a lot of different kind of discussion points and opportunities to just understand where you potentially are doing well and where you potentially could improve. But certainly from a deliverables perspective in this stage, what I definitely want to see is a list of your most risk or your highest risk departments, a specific list of your riskiest users, based on that dynamic risk kind of profiling, as well as your kind of top riskiest or highest risk assets. So next, the monitoring phase. And here we have what is essentially a kind of a pretty intelligence collection plan. An ICP is a list of all of your approved, tested, and verified intelligence sources or log sources or technologies that can give you a feed of information or intelligence that you can use to actually conduct an investigation or to provide context, or be an indicator or warning of a pending insider threat. And these do range from, you know, being proactive to reactive. But if we start off in the kind of left-hand side, we've got all the external threats, and you know, you see a couple of these, and what this is, you know, you're not going to necessarily always be notified from an external source that, you know, you could potentially be under at risk of an insider threat. But what it can do is, like I said, provide that trigger. Real key one for me, you know, social media. And I'm not saying you monitor all your kind of users, but it can be a real, you know, really good indicator if you know, someone's LinkedIn, or someone creates a LinkedIn account and adds a load of recruiters, or starts conversing with competitors and what have you. You know, you can get that kind of behavioral intelligence just to identify anything potentially in the future. Moving over to internal, and I think this is where, you know, standard MDR or managed detection and response looks very much at the technical aspect and uses contextual data based on, you know, AD or users or kind of other kind of behavioral kind of machine learning and what have you. In the internal aspect really is that human and cross-functional partnership with your HR department, your IT department, your risk teams, as well as your senior leadership. And there's some real crucial stages, certainly, you know, pre-screening as part of the onboarding process during HR. You know, has there been, is this in place, and has there been anything identified that could be potentially a red flag? As screening is ongoing, is there any kind of significant changes to an individual's personal circumstances, you know, at home or professionally, that could be, again, another alert or trigger to increasing the risk of that users. And I also think the use of a kind of whistleblower and the education of, or the inclusion of whistleblower kind of hotlines and what have you in an organization is crucial, to have that anonymous kind of tip off or anonymous intelligence feed, because it's, you know, typically they are linked to ethics and legal kind of incidents, but it can be used as an effective way of reporting potential insider threats as well. Now, moving on to technical, from an insider threat perspective, you know, a lot of organizations will focus their protective controls and their monitoring and detective controls on external sources, and they will be, you know, fairly perimeter heavy, with a, you know, lateral or lateral movement being a kind of inclusion in that at the kind of network level. But at the user level, and that's obviously what we're looking at from a insider threat perspective, is what is the actual user doing on the endpoint, on the asset, and what is it? What is the kind of how are those? How is that correlated? It takes a very mature MDR program to, you know, correlate those use cases for all the various activities that a user can do that could be linked to insider threat activity. Now, I know Damian's going to go into a lot more detail in the other half of the slide, but yeah, just one definitely to bear in mind: the use of a kind of authoritative or a kind of single pane of glass technology that can cover that user activity that is then fed into your SIEM is obviously the gold standard solution there from an insider threat management perspective. Now, I'd also, I know I said I'd cover it at the start, but you know, whether it's privacy regulations, whether it's, you know, the international law of armed conflict, the morality or the ethics behind intelligence operations or operations which involve the monitoring and detection of kind of users' personal, you know, people's actual activity, they do have to be targeted. So that's what, you know, that's what the identifies phase is going to do for your organization. That's going to identify those that are the most at risk or the most risk to the business. Then as well as, is it justifiable? So is there a legitimate business reason for you to be monitoring those endpoints, those users? And then finally, authorized. And this comes into, is it authorized at the, you know, at the senior or the executive level? And finally, is it an authorized intelligence feed? So if it's on the intelligence collection plan, there's then going to be those controls that are put in place to watch the watchers. There will be those logs, and it will be a protected environment that, you know, there will be some very sensitive data that is most likely in your insider threat solution or within those investigations. So there's got to be sufficient controls around the protection of those as well. So actually, moving on to the kind of final the final two sections, we have analysis and review. Key principle of intelligence is centralized control, validation, and corroboration. So identifying and having a single point of analysis where that is conducted. Finally, source protection, I mentioned it before. You know, I actually identifying what the source is, it being anonymous or being actually, you know, protected from unauthorized access and disclosure. And one thing, you know, it is every kind of SOC manager or CISO's kind of nemesis, and that's the, you know, the retention of logs and how we actually get those the logs, and are they the right logs, and are they giving us the right visibility into for us to provide the analysis and the supporting work for any investigations. And ultimately, you know, it does need to have a kind of objective party or panel that is conducting the assessment of what the activity actually is. Is it legitimate or not? So in the kind of review, the review aspect, what you're going to get is ultimately actionable intelligence. And from an operations perspective or an investigative perspective, not all actionable intelligence ends in an actual response. It can just be to feed into the bigger picture. But what a kind of insider threat, a dedicated solution will do is provide you with the option to respond through alerting and coaching the user there and then, or through actually covert and passive monitoring to then build up an investigation for subsequent either legislative or disciplinary activity. It'll also give you an insight into, you know, how you can actually remediate those risks, either compromise or user based. It'll also give you this period is where you'll get to review your threat feeds, review your technologies, make sure that they are still compliant with the kind of code of ethics that I mentioned earlier. And then again, as with all investigations, the conduct of a post investigation or incident review and continuous improvement plan with that cycled approach, you know, annual basis, keep going round, and any significant instance obviously gives you the chance to kind of do a kind of after action review. So that pretty much covers off my part in the presentation. I'm now going to hand over to Damian, who, as I say, is going to give us a look at the specific use cases as well as the kind of proof point technologies that are really going to be a force multiplier within your environment to either use as a standalone or as part of your current managed detection and response program.
Thanks, Nick. So this slide shows some standard out-of-the-box rules that we provide customers to select from when they're deploying our solutions. So some of the biggest increases on the right in green were in ones you'd expect. For example, accessing upload and sharing cloud services. So these are likely by users trying to collaborate by working around slow file shares and overwhelmed VPNs. We also have exporting data from enterprise web applications, something which has a less obvious instant connection to working from home and could perhaps be used as exporting data from corporate systems for nefarious purposes, now that there's no one to see them do it. And many more ways to get that data out without a corporate proxy server and perimeter controls to go through. Some of the others, visiting adult sites, gambling sites, or hate sites, are again another sign of the new freedom which users have at home. And while users are free to do things at home that they shouldn't do in the office, It should not be on work time and definitely not be on a corporate laptop, especially when there's a higher risk of malware or other threats on more niche and unregulated sites. And then again, there's use of cloud storage, again, this time with native apps rather than a web upload. So of course, there are also these other alerts which haven't increased disproportionately during the pandemic, but are still significant, like clearing browsing history from Chrome, printing large print jobs, and copying fast USB, which is very important to have visibility of as well, particularly if they're against policy or they should have preventative controls in place already. So when focusing on the user, we tend to focus on the 3 most common ways in which we can help customers. So let's talk through those. The first case is really how we got talking about ITM solutions, which is that it's a technical detective control to identify which are the risk users and what actions are users performing that are risky. Then we move to protect against data loss from those who have access to the data. Now, this is a very different approach to traditional DLP solutions, in that we look at the behavior and risk indicators leading up to the event in an effort to flag the risks before the event takes place. And then the third is to accelerate incident response. And I'm sure there's people in this session responsible for that incident response aspect that understand how complicated this process can be. Traditional processes take a lot of time, they involve many cross-functional groups, and every minute a case is open, the risk is still present. Our approach is really, because we can be the authoritative source of user behavior, to have all these answers in one place at the outset, and so accelerate this process from weeks and months to ideally minutes or hours. So let's take a look at an example scenario. What we'll do here is we'll talk through an example of how we protect against data loss, which is really one of the more concerning scenarios for working from home workers in the pandemic. So as an example, you might have a user that accesses your CRM or another system houses encryptable data, and then they proceed to download client lists or price lists. They rename and otherwise obfuscate the data to try and thwart DLP and log analysis, and then package it up and obfuscate it further. Now, rather than attempt to upload via a web browser, they then install something like Dropbox or another cloud storage application, and they sync it up to the cloud via a secure TLS connection. Or they might also try sending it as an encrypted attachment via email. So this is an easy example, and you can see there are some elements of this chain that might or might not be picked up according to the existing security stack. The trick is stringing together all these actions, both to understand the full scope of the activity of that user, and also to understand and demonstrate whether there was malicious intent. So logs are very tricky in practice to provide this visibility, to track this complete sequence of events. You need to ensure that all the logs related to each of these stages were collected, correctly parsed so you could find them, and then retained and available at the point that you actually do the investigation, which could be quite a way down the line. You'd also need to spend the time retrieving, bundling, and explaining the content of these logs to the relevant internal non-technical audiences who need to be convinced of your analysis to consider approaching the user and perhaps considering legal action. So with that, what I'd like to do is demo a typical working from home use case on the live platform. We'll come up in a new browser, per se. So now we're seeing the alerts for Bob. And we see there's about 10 or 12 different alerts that he triggered in his last session, which is quite a few. And we can see these in reverse time order. So starting from when he logged in irregular hours at 1 in the morning. Now, again, this is probably more common in the working from home scenario, but these are all configurable. So he logged in remotely. He then logged into an internal business application and exported data from the application, which is more concerning. After that, he then sent an email with a file attachment to an untrusted domain. He uploaded the sensitive file to a website, and he exfiltrated data to a cloud storage sync folder. Now, as you can see, I've opened up more details on this first alert, which is exporting the data from the application. And you can see here, who was it? It was Bob. So we break this down very clearly. Who was it? What did they do? Well, he went to the CRM application on this URL, and he downloaded a file called boardresolution.doc. And then once he did that, he then continued with these other activities. So he then went into trying to email that out to an untrusted domain. And after that, he then uploaded a sensitive file to a website. And again, we can see the full details of this. So you can see that he uploaded the file. The file was called holidaypictures.jpg, which doesn't sound particularly sensitive. I mean, that's perfectly reasonable, although the use of Gorilla Mail is suspect. Gorilla Mail is a popular anonymous and secure webmail service, which appears to have not been blocked in this case. Or maybe he wasn't coming through the proxy at all. But we see that although the original file name was, the file name we saw was holidaypictures.jpg, that the original file name was boardresolution.doc. And in fact, what's happened is this is a file he downloaded from the CRM as this file, and then he's done something to this, basically renamed it before exporting it. I can look at the file history and see the full history of that file from the moment he accessed it. So you can see here that he downloaded it from the CRM application as boardresolution.doc, and then we can see with the full date timestamp every action he performed with that file once we were tracking it. So he attached it to an email and sent it to a colleague or a friend. Then he moved it and renamed it to that holiday picture JPEG file. And then after he'd renamed it, he tried to exfiltrate it in different ways. So he uploaded it to Gorilla Mail, and he also uploaded it to Dropbox, and then he deleted the file from his machine. So although it seems he seems to have tried to obfuscate his actions here by renaming it, or he could be doing something like zipping it or something else, because we're tracking this file on his endpoint, we can pick all this up. And so if he tries to take measures to bypass cloud DLP or email DLP, we can still see him performing these actions on the endpoint. So as I can see, Bob is definitely doing a few dodgy things. And what I'd like to do is look at this in more detail. So if I take the original alerts, which I was looking at, we see that he also triggered another couple, such as running an anti-forensics tool and clearing his browsing history in Chrome. So I'm going to go here, I'm going to go away from looking at Bob from a top-down approach and look at him in more detail. We're using these alerts and rules as technical detective controls to identify which users are risky. And once they end up in this dashboard as a risky user, we can go into this incident response process where we can triage everything they did. So I'm going to go and look at Bob in more detail, and I'll do that by expanding one of these alerts, and I'm going to view Bob's session in basically a full timeline of Bob's session. So we'll open that up. So what we have here is that session we were looking at just now, but now we have every event, every action that Bob performed on his endpoint. So from when he first logged in and Google Drive Sync was loaded in the tray, he opened up Windows Explorer. Then he used search probably to run an application. So he likely ran Windows Explorer from the search bar. He opened up Outlook. Then he opened up Chrome. And that's where he went into the CRM application. So you see him browsing on the CRM application here, navigating through a few pages before he finds the file he wants, the board resolution, and then he downloads and exports that file, the board resolution file. Now, this is giving us context. He's not accessing multiple documents. He's not browsing around for a long time. It seems he knows exactly what he's looking for, and he's navigating straight to it. After that, he opens the document in Word, probably to check what's inside it. And then once he's decided what's inside it is useful, he then goes into Outlook, attaches board resolution, which we're tracking, to an email, and sends this email out to a colleague. After that, now this is interesting. So he sends the email, then he opens up Google Chrome and Google's how to bypass email blocking. So evidently that didn't work for him very well. So he then does a bit of research on how he can bypass his DLP and his spam filters. He decides on an approach, because then what he does is he opens up Windows Explorer, he copies the file somewhere else, and then he pastes the file, and then you see him renaming the file here from boardresolution.doc to holidaypictures.jpg. And after that, he goes into Gorilla Mail, and he then writes an email in Gorilla Mail and uploads the file that he's renamed to bypass DLP. So you can see him performing all these actions, and we're monitoring this blow by blow and generating this metadata, which we can then trigger those rules off and retain for evidential purposes. Now, what we can also do, optionally, is we can trigger screen recording. So if, for example, Bob does something particularly risky, like uploading a sensitive board document to Gorilla Mail after having renamed it, we can generate an alert here, and we can actually perform that screen capture, and that will capture the events on his screen at that time, which gives us more context as to what his intentions were around that activity, and also give us more context around what was on the screen, what he did before, and what he did after the action. So you see here, we're now looking at Bob's screen. Here's him on Gorilla Mail, and you see he's about to send this email, which triggered our upload alert. We can scroll back in time from the alert bar that you see there, the alert button, to see what he was doing before that. So you see, I'll go back a bit further. See, he's been Googling disposable email addresses. He then decides to go back to Windows Explorer, find the board resolution doc, and now he's renaming it to familyphotos.jpg. So we can see that his actions are basically deliberate. He's not doing this because DLP is merely an inconvenience. He seems to be deliberately obfuscating his tracks to exfiltrate this sensitive data from the organization. He does this in multiple ways, and as we saw at the end, he actually then runs anti-forensics tools at the end, which would further imply that this is a malicious event rather than innocent use of cloud storage or innocent use of webmail. Okay, so we've established that Bob seems bad. He's a bad Bob. So what we need to do now is build a package of evidence to present to his manager and potentially to law enforcement, detailing all his actions. So what we would do here is we'll switch away from the screen recording and go back to the main console. I'm going to take the alerts which Bob triggered, and I'm going to add some of these and build a report around these. So in terms of what we need to establish the context of Bob's actions, we're going to take the fact that he exported data out of the CRM in the first place, that he tried to upload this to Gorilla Mail, and then he then also synced this to cloud storage applications. So I'll take those 5. I can run a PDF, and that'll give me a nicely packaged PDF, which I can then take to his manager and to other non-technical audiences in a way that's easy to understand. And that's important because I could be doing many of these investigations a week, and I don't want to have to spend time packaging up and then trying to explain what particular technical data is. So with the reports that we have here, you can see that we have a quite aesthetically pleasing report where we have the details of each of the alerts which Bob triggered, which led to him being featured on the user risk dashboard. And then for each of these alerts, we can see with his full profile details and the action that took place, the severity is critical. We have a screen capture of activity taking place at the time, which is both easier to understand and pretty irrefutable. And then, of course, all the details from the metadata about the file that he uploaded being holidaypictures.jpg, that he sent this to Gorilla Mail, and that it was originally from the CRM, and it was originally a board resolution document. And we have each of those alerts in full detail in the PDF. And the user, if they have access, can even play back the video of the action at the time. So this is really useful. because it basically serves stakeholders with all the context they need to be able to take action on it. So in summary, as we discussed there, the pandemic format does really create this perfect conditions for insider threat for these reasons. People are working from home, so many of the traditional controls you have about working in an office, such as badging people in, being able to identify people, colleagues seeing their colleagues in the office, people working in the office where there's the chance of someone seeing their screen or seeing what they're working on. All this is to some extent gone away. People can work much more freely in their home environment, assuming it is the person that's supposed to be there, it's not someone else using their laptop. People can, they can view things, they can work on documents without the chance of anyone taking them from seeing their screen. And this does introduce new risks, as well as, of course, the challenges that there have been around using shared services over VPNs, and the fact that many people have been using other shadow IT services such as cloud storage, etc., to circumvent issues that they're having accessing corporate resources. There's also that risk of departing users, where in organizations where there are more people departing, this does present significant risk to organizations, particularly if people are feeling under much more pressure to present the best foot forward when they're joining a new organization, and they might be tempted to take data, whether it be customer data or IP developed by the company. That risk is there and requires controlling. And in order to address these risks, many organizations do have an insider threat management program. It might be formalized, especially in the case of large organizations, or it might be fairly informal and something which is addressed by, say, a security manager. But the need to actually structure the insider threat management in whichever way you do it, and assess your risk, assess which controls are going to address those, and go through that process is important. And then also having those controls to detect risk, to mitigate it, and to perform incident response where it's required, including engaging stakeholders. Having all those tools and controls available is important in order to be able to go through that process seamlessly when that unfortunate event does turn up. And with that, we'd like to go to any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, guys. I think we've run just a little bit over time there. So Nick will be at the Missing Link and Proofpoint booth. So if you guys have any questions, you can go to him directly. I'm sure I'll stick around to answer them.